Welcome to episode 23 of Arbiter of Worlds. If you're a returning subscriber, thanks for supporting the channel. If you're new to the channel, hello. Here at Arbiter of Worlds, we study the art and science of running and creating tabletop role-playing games. So let's get into it. The question before us today is an important one. Should your fantasy tabletop RPG campaign have innately evil races? Should orcs be evil? Yes. Okay, fine. We will drill deeper. Honestly, I think most of you watching the video genuinely do know the answer is that simple, but it remains a perennial topic of debate among the extremely online. Therefore, I'm going to do something I never do, which is make a simple thing complicated for the sake of better gaming. Let's return to the question. Should your fantasy tabletop RPG campaign have innately evil races? More specifically, should orcs be evil? To answer those questions, there's three different factors we need to consider. What is a fantasy race? What is innate evil? And why should you include innately evil races? Let's start with what is a fantasy race. In my best-selling and incredibly compelling book, Buy This ACKS, which is on sale now in the links below, I wrote the following. Since J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, fantasy worlds have had races. In Middle-earth, the races were man, elf, dwarf, hobbit, and orc and troll. Tolkien's races were translated virtually one-to-one into Dungeons & Dragons during the 1970s, and from there metastasized into every other role-playing game in most video games. Along the way, some halflings got renamed, hello halflings, some races got split into sub-races like dark elves and mountain dwarves, and lots of new races got introduced, including some that became so popular as to dominate a lot of contemporary play. For a while, virtually every RPG, CRPG, and MMORPG on the planet had you select a race alongside a class as the formative choice you made when creating a character. But despite this abiding popularity, race has begun to go out of favor with some contemporary circles of the role-playing game community. In some venues, in fact, the term has become so weaponized that its primary use is as a cudgel in online arguments. Let's put aside the partisan cruft. In a fantasy RPG, a race is nothing more than a species within the same genus as the human species. It might be a species that's so closely related to Homo sapiens that it can interbreed with humanity to produce fertile offspring, just as a brown bear and a polar bear can. It might be a more distant cousin where interbreeding is possible but results in sterility, as between a donkey and a horse. But if we were horses, our fantasy races would be donkeys, onagers, mountain zebras, and plain zebras. If we were polar bears, our fantasy races would be black bear and brown bear. If we were dogs, our fantasy races would be coyote, gray wolf, red wolf, golden jackal, and so on. Now, because a fantasy race is a distinct species from humanity, albeit a closely related one, it often gets used as a proxy for the concept of species as a whole. So someone might speak of the race of centaurs, even though centaurs are clearly not homos. Centaurs are clearly not members of Homo sapiens. And that's fine. The word species sounds very scientific, and sometimes that feels out of place in a fantasy RPG. At the same time, it's also fine to just use the word species. I don't begrudge anyone who prefers one word or the other. It's just a semantic indicator of meaning. The meaning is what matters. Whatever you call them, the important point is that the word race in a fantasy world does not mean the same thing as the word race in the context of US Census data. The different fantasy races are distinct species. More importantly, they are not stand-ins for Earth's human races. And we can be certain of that because we know that fantasy races are stand-ins for something else. They are stand-ins for the rival hominids with which the human species struggled for dominance during the evolutionary adaptive period. Population genetics has proven, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that during the prehistoric era in which our species evolved, we were confronted by the existence of many other sapient hominids, including Neanderthals, Denisovans, and many others. Now, about 12 years ago, a man named Danny Vendramini released an excellent book called Them and Us, How Neanderthal Predation Created Modern Humans. In Them and Us, Vendramini made a lot of claims about Neanderthals, and at the time his views were entirely out of step with mainstream thinking. Since then, several of his claims have been vindicated. In particular, he's turned out to be absolutely correct that Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalis did not live in peace and harmony. They slaughtered each other. At one point, the Neanderthals had the upper hand and the human species was reduced to the verge of extinction. Later, we humans turned the tables and exterminated the Neanderthals. Archaeologists, anthropologists, and other apologists have begun to acknowledge the bloodiness of our prehistory. But in mainstream discussion, it's presented as if we, evil human beings, murderously killed off Fred Flintstone. Not so, says Vendramini. Neanderthals were nothing like Fred Flintstone. He says they were hunched, cannibalistic predators with large shining eyes and animalistic snouts, covered by thick fur and massive muscles, built for close combat, hunting by night, with a brutish guttural voice and a huge mouth with huge teeth and powerful jaws. They didn't look like Fred Flintstone. They looked like this. Neanderthals were orcs. Vendramini, in fact, argues that all of the worldwide myths of goblins, orcs, ogres, onis, and so on, they're all based on the prehistorical struggle between us and Neanderthals. It's a great read. If you'd like to know more about the book Them and Us, I actually wrote an entire essay about this topic called When Orcs Were Real. I've linked it in the description below. For now, what you need to know is that when Homo sapiens encountered Homo neanderthalis, it was a struggle to the death. We won, they lost. But it could have gone the other way, and it almost did. And the reason for this deadly struggle is called the competitive exclusion principle, also known as Gauss's law. This is a law of biology, and it states that two species that compete for the same resources cannot coexist. One of the species will always overcome the other, leading the latter to suffer extinction. Gauss's law, as it happens, is the perfect framework to assess what innately evil means in the context of a fantasy world. From the point of view of a human race in a fantasy world, an innately evil race is one with which peaceful coexistence is impossible. One of the two species is going to drive the other into extinction. There is no live and let live. There's only an endless war to cause or prevent extinction. Now, the very best example of this that you'll ever see comes in the movie Aliens. The xenomorphs are a species with which our own coexistence is impossible. They compete with us for the most precious of resources, our own bodies, which they use for reproduction. Nevertheless, the humans who confront the xenomorphs split into two factions. Ellen Ripley wants to wipe them out. She says, I say we take off and nuke the entire site from orbit. It's the only way to be sure. Carter Burke in the other faction says, this is clearly an important species we're dealing with, and I don't think that you or I or anybody has the right to arbitrarily exterminate them. And Ripley says, wrong. Now, nobody with a functional moral compass who watches the movie Aliens thinks Burke is the hero. He's the villain. He is willing to risk human lives for xenomorphs. Ripley is the hero because she wants to save her fellow humans by wiping out the xenomorphs. Burke is chaotic evil, Ripley is lawful good. Burke is also foolish because he wrongly thinks there might be some way to coexist with the xenomorphs. Ripley is wise because she rightly knows about the competitive exclusion principle. Humans and xenomorphs cannot coexist. One has to go extinct. I'm not exaggerating. Ripley understands this as an existential threat. She says as much in her interview with the Weyland-Yutani board. If one of those things gets down here, then that will be all, and all this bullshit that you think is so important, you can just kiss all that goodbye. Now, if Carter Burke were on RPG Twitter, he would say something like, orcs are an important species, and no so-called paladin has the right to arbitrarily exterminate them. And if Ripley were on RPG Twitter, she would say, wrong, and Ripley would be correct. So when I assert that you should have innately evil races in your fantasy RPG, I'm very specifically saying that you should have races with which humanity's coexistence is as impossible as humanity's coexistence with the xenomorphs and aliens. If orcs are like the xenomorphs, you should kill them on sight. Orc juveniles, they're face huggers. Kill them with fire. Orc babies, xeno eggs. Blow them up with explosions. Don't try to raise an orc up to be a good person. It'll just grow up and eat your face. Don't try to make peace, us versus them. Now, in a fantasy world, you can add metaphysical layers to this life or death struggle. Warhammer is very good at doing this. There's no question that the Imperium of Man is in a life or death struggle with competitive species such as Tyranids, and no one is going to negotiate a peace treaty with them. At the same time, there's deeper religious or cosmological nuances relating to gods, demons, afterlife, and the warp. All of that is great, but you don't need it. An innately evil race is simply a race with which the human race cannot coexist. So that brings us to our third and final question. Why should you have innately evil races? I'm going to offer a glib answer, and then I'm going to give a thoughtful answer. The glib answer is this. Aliens wouldn't be a space horror movie if Ripley and the alien queen were able to talk through their differences and come to a negotiated settlement for the colonization of LV-426. That would make Aliens part of a different genre, something like 80s classic Enemy Mine. Enemy Mine is a great movie, but if you want to watch a horror movie about life or death struggle with aliens, it's not the right choice. Likewise, fantasy RPGs wouldn't be traditional fantasy if there weren't life or death struggles between good and evil races. So to the extent that you want to enjoy classic and familiar gameplay, you stick with the trope. That's the glib answer. A thoughtful answer. So to give that answer, we need to inquire, why do so many of our pastimes revolve around vicariously experiencing life or death struggle between good and evil, in which violence is the only solution? This is not a modern phenomenon. Since the dawn of history, all of our myths, our legends, our folktales have revolved around savage struggle with existential stakes. Why? There's many answers to this question, but to me, it seems that human nature has been irrevocably marred, one might say. And maybe it was marred by that life or death struggle of our ancestors against the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, and so on. But part of human nature is to be competitive, to be hostile, and to use violence to protect the interests of family or nation against those with whom peace is impossible. If we didn't have that part of ourselves, if human beings were as gentle and loving as bonobos, we'd have been annihilated by cannibalistic Neanderthals. But part of human nature is to be cooperative, compassionate, to seek harmony of interest through diplomacy and trade. And in fact, it's probably the case that our superior sociability is what enabled us to triumph against stronger, faster, big-brain Neanderthals. So human beings are both warriors and diplomats, both fighters and lovers. And because of that cooperative, loving aspect of human nature, there's an internal pain, there's a guilt that arises when we are hostile, when we are violent. We feel the betrayal of part of ourselves. But if we are violent towards an enemy committed to our destruction, if we are violent towards an innately evil enemy, then we feel no guilt. We feel the righteous wrath of the hero. And this is why World War II movies with Nazi villains are perennially popular. And that's why Vietnam War movies with Viet Cong villains are considered anti-war or problematic. Orcs, being innately evil, can be killed in the fantasy world, allowing us to show our warrior aspect without causing guilt from our peaceful sides. And in our 21st century world, very few of us ever have the chance to let out the warrior aspect of personality. In fact, the entirety of modern society is structured to make sure the warrior aspect of human nature is only experienced in specific socially acceptable channels such as martial arts or gaming. A young man in 9th century Norway could take sail each June in a longship to sail to distant shores and hew many foemen. A young man in 21st century Norway cannot. And that hole, that warrior-shaped gap in our experiential horizon, is what people seek to fill with entertainment, sports, movies, video games, and yes, tabletop RPGs. And filling that hole in peaceful, pro-social ways like a tabletop RPG is a very good thing. Now, critics of traditional styles of play assert that filling the hole is a bad thing. They claim they have the moral high ground, that they've risen above such things. They will assert that more sophisticated players want to experience interspecies diplomacy. They want to explore matters of moral philosophy. They want to delve into the deconstruction of notions of the other in human discourse. Bollocks. Such critics are totally missing the point. We can do all of those things in the real world. The real world provides us with endless opportunity for debate, trade, cooperation, coexistence. What the real world does not provide us is the opportunity to gnaw on our shields until we enter a seething berserk fury and can unleash red-handed mayhem on the innately evil orcs of the jutting mountains. And unless and until that situation changes, RPGs can and should continue to include evil orcs against whom we can so rage. Don't forget to righteously press the like and subscribe button so that the innately evil YouTube algorithm can be taught a lesson in pain, and then rage about this in the comments below. I'll see you next week.